Joining me now, NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell in Tokyo, New York Times Pentagon correspondent Helene Cooper, and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, now president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Kelly, I happen to be watching this live early this morning or late last night, whichever part of the globe you're in. And I don't know, I was taken aback. What was the reaction in the room?
There was certainly a sense of this being a new kind of unpredictability from Joe Biden, the president, because he is in Asia making these controversial comments. He has made foreign policy one of the centerpieces of his expertise as president, and he has made comments like this before, where his own administration has carefully come back and said no change in U.S. policy. And as you watched, and I did as well, the fullness of the president's remarks, he was careful to say one China policy is still in effect. The specifics and letter of the U.S. policy and all that it entails, the conventions that we have signed on to, are in place. But his words and his intention were giving a very different impression, and he was putting it in the context of what has happened with Russia and Ukraine, and saying the barbarism of Russia must be met with ongoing, long-standing consequences for Vladimir Putin and Russia as a sign to China not to take action against Taiwan. So when you put all of that in context, the strategic ambiguity, a term of art in diplomacy that has long said the U.S. would not be clear about its specific actions against China in a public way. In a sense, not having an ultimatum, not having a public line in the sand against China, to have a competitive and complex relationship with China publicly, but to try to keep a peace with all of the economic and geopolitical relationship that exists there. The president amped it up, and to think that he did that in Asia with all of the world context, knowing that aides in the room were uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, and then quickly moving to respond. Now, I'm also struck by something when the president was in Poland and talked about Putin cannot remain in power. And then a few days later in Washington, I asked him if he agreed with his administration walking that back, and he said no. So there may be a piece of Joe Biden on the world stage that we are now seeing where he is inserting his own level of unpredictability on matters to try to sort of move the issues, not abandoning U.S. policy, but perhaps shaping it in a way that he sees as more appropriate in this moment. Andrea?
It's a very good point, Kelly. We all remember that in Warsaw. Ivo Daalder, China pushed back today, not surprisingly saying no one should underestimate its ability to defend China's national sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is a policy that goes back to 1979 and Jimmy Carter, the One China policy. Any concern about increasing tensions with China?
Well, you never want to increase tensions, but I also think that this is not the first time the president has said this. It's really the third or maybe even the fourth time he said it. And at some point, we probably need to take him at his word. I think U.S. policy has always made clear that on the one hand, it accepts a one China policy, but on the other hand, it wants the differences between Taiwan and China to be resolved peacefully. And insisting on a peaceful resolution. It also doesn't want Taiwan to take actions that would provoke a China to necessarily engage in military force, which presumably a declaration of independence would. That's where the strategic ambiguity problem has come from. I think what the president is saying is that given what the Chinese have been doing over the past few years, the kind of military operations in the Straits, the constantly buzzing of Taiwan's airspace, its ships coming in closer, that if there is a real invasion, which is the question that was asked, then the United States is most likely going to be there with Taiwan. I think that's a very welcome kind of sign that there are limits to what China can do, that in a world in which major powers start using force against neighbors without being provoked, there are consequences. We're seeing those consequences in Ukraine. We're seeing them with regard to Russia. I think the president is signaling to the Chinese that the kind of things we're seeing in Ukraine are the kinds of things we would be prepared to do with regard to Taiwan, a longstanding, very close partner of the United States.
And a big defense partner as well, of course. Helene, militarily, what would the U.S. defense of Taiwan even look like, given that China's only 1 mile away across the strait?
Hi, Andrea. Thanks for having me. I mean, that's just the thing, isn't it? I mean, Biden has what he's doing right now is the very definition, I would argue, of strategic ambiguity. Nobody he's went out and said agreed, yes, the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily, but what does that even mean? Does that mean American boots on the ground? We certainly have plenty of troops over in Asia to begin with, particularly in South Korea, who can get there quickly. But he didn't say that. He left that up in the air. Does that mean, is the administration now starting to is talking about using a Ukrainian model where they could say, we'll send them as much weaponry as we can to help them, but we won't put boots on the ground. That's not clear either. But I think what Ivo is saying about this is Ukraine is behind all of this. And this is the administration sending a message. This is Biden sending a message to China to just be aware that things that they should not make assumptions about what the United States will do at this time. You've seen this pattern again and again. Biden did this exact same thing last October on this very issue with Taiwan, and the White House walked it back. You mentioned he did this last month on Ukraine, and he's done it again. And I think this is, I think it's Ivo Daalder is right that we should be taking the president at his word, but we should also be aware of the fact that for more than a year and a half now, American troops have been on the ground in Taiwan, secretly training. It was a secret until about last summer when there were press reports about this, but secretly training Taiwanese military. There've been American special ops troops on the ground and American Marines. That's been going on for quite some time. It started during the Trump administration and it continued into the Biden administration. So, we certainly sell a lot of weaponry to Taiwan. They're viewed as a strategic partner, but also Biden compared them last year to South Korea and Japan when talking about whether we would be willing to defend them. That's a high bar to put them in.
Yeah, that's really interesting information. And of course, they've been big military partners, big military recipients, purchasers of our weaponry. So that is a good warning to, or perhaps an important strategic, tactical, I should say, warning to China, which has been supportive of Russia on sanctions and is still buying a lot of Russian oil. Thank you very much to Kelly O'Donnell, Helene Cooper, Ivo Daalder, to all.